Crime pays, the price you can never escape. Hook. Ever wondered what happens when crime finally catches up? What if the price for your actions is more than you ever imagined? Stick around till the end, because this chilling tale will leave you questioning everything about the choices you make. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Keep watching. The alley was quiet. A thin mist curled along the ground. The dim streetlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move. Jack's footsteps echoed. He didn't look back. Not tonight. Not when the deal was almost done. He could hear his own breath, shallow and quick. The leather of his coat creaked as he walked. His fingers clenched around the envelope. The weight of it pressed against his chest. Money. A small fortune. He knew the risks. But the reward was too great. Too tempting. At the end of the alley, the figure waited. Tall, hooded, faceless. Jack could barely make out the features. The figure's presence felt cold. Jack approached, the sound of his shoes dragging on the damp pavement. The air smelled of rain and something else. Something metallic. The figure didn't speak. Jack handed over the envelope. The figure's gloved hand took it without a word. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the figure moved, quickly, almost too fast. A sharp noise cut through the silence. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. He turned to leave but froze. The alley seemed to stretch, to twist. Was it his imagination? Or was the world shrinking around him? A sudden pressure gripped his chest. He gasped for air. The figure was closer now. Jack could feel its presence at his back. He turned, but there was nothing. Just the same dim alley. The figure was gone. A rustle came from behind. He spun again. But again nothing. His heart pounded louder. The envelope was gone. But Jack didn't remember when it left his hand. The silence thickened. Jack's hands were shaking now. Was this the price? Had the deal gone wrong? Something was coming. He could feel it. The cold fingers of dread crawling up his spine. Suddenly, the streetlight flickered one last time. Then it went out completely. Total darkness. And then, a whisper. Too quiet to understand. But Jack knew what it was. The deal wasn't over. Not yet. And it wasn't going to end well. The whisper grew louder. It wasn't in his ears. It was inside his mind. A voice. Cold, familiar. Did you think it was that easy? Jack froze. His blood ran cold. His hands were trembling now, gripping his sides. The alley seemed to close in on him. Darkness swallowed every inch of light. Every direction was the same. He was lost. He had never been here before. But somehow, it felt like he had. A slow shuffle echoed in the blackness. Jack turned quickly, but no one was there. The damp air felt heavier now. Each breath came slower. Thick, almost suffocating. His mouth was dry. His heart was thudding in his chest. And then, he felt it. The weight of something behind him. A presence. Looming. He spun again. Nothing. His body was moving on its own now. He couldn't control his steps. His shoes scraped against the ground, dragging him forward. It wasn't the alley that was closing in on him. It was something else. Something, alive. A flicker of light appeared. A brief moment of clarity. Just enough to see shadows. Tall, thin figures. Their outlines shifting like smoke. They moved silently, like ghosts. Jack's breath caught. His mind was spinning. The figures closed in. They were circling him. No escape. Crime pays, Jack, a voice said, far too calm. He knew that voice. It was his own. But twisted. Unrecognizable. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. His legs gave way beneath him. And he fell. The cold ground met his skin. Sharp, unyielding. He couldn't breathe. The shadows were closer now, their forms blurring. Jack tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't obey. He was trapped. A cold hand gripped his shoulder. A pressure. It wasn't human. His vision blurred. Did you really think you could take it all? The voice whispered again. The shadows engulfed him. The last thing Jack saw was the dim outline of a figure, standing above him. The same hooded figure from before. And then darkness. Everything went silent. The alley was empty. As if Jack had never been there at all. The air was still. The mist clung to the ground, thickening. A few moments passed, or maybe it was longer. Time felt warped now. There were no footsteps, no whispers. Only the quiet. But something was wrong. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. And then, a sharp sound. The creak of a door. A distant light flickered to life at the end of the alley. Weak and uncertain, like it didn't want to be seen. A figure stepped into the light. Tall. Pale. It was him. Jack. Or what was left of him. His clothes were torn. His face pale and hollow. He moved like a puppet, jerky, unsteady. His eyes empty. There was no recognition in them. Just a dull, vacant stare. He took a step forward, then another. Slowly, deliberately. The envelope. The same one Jack had held earlier. It appeared in his hand. But now, the paper was different. It wasn't the same crisp, clean envelope from before. It was stained, torn. A smear of red across its surface. Jack's movements were mechanical, lifeless. He walked down the alley, not looking at anything. Not even the light. He just kept walking. And as he passed by, the shadows seemed to shift. They didn't follow him, though. They stayed behind, where they belong. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Jack's footsteps. Then, another figure appeared. Not in the alley. But behind the first figure. A darker shape, hidden in the mist. The new figure didn't move. It just watched. And in that stillness, the truth settled. Crime always pays. But it doesn't always pay in the way you expect. Sometimes, it collects the price in a form you can't escape. The figure in the mist remained still, watching Jack as he moved further down the alley. Its presence felt like a weight pressing down on the air, suffocating the space. Jack's footsteps grew quieter with each step. Like he was walking further away from something that was no longer there. The figure in the mist didn't blink. It didn't need to. Its eyes, or what could be called eyes, glowed faintly, like dying embers. Jack reached the end of the alley, his back to the street. The light there was faint, sickly yellow. A car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating him. For just a moment, he looked normal. Alive. But the mask was thin. And behind his eyes, the emptiness was beginning to show. Suddenly, he stopped. As if he had reached the end of his path. He turned slowly, his movements stiff. The alley seemed to stretch out in front of him. But there was no way forward now. No one to meet him. The figure in the mist didn't speak. But Jack's mouth opened, as if he were trying to say something. His lips trembled. Nothing came out. He took one final, jerking step toward the darkness. And the figure stepped forward, closer this time. A soft sound escaped the figure's lips, like a breath from a place that didn't belong to the world of the living. Jack stopped. His head turned, and his empty eyes locked with the figure's glowing ones. There was a faint recognition in them. A flicker of realization. This was it. This was the cost. The figure's hand reached out. Slow, deliberate. And Jack's body moved, as if against his will, toward the hand. It felt like the final step in a dance. One he couldn't stop, no matter how badly he wanted to. The figure's fingers brushed Jack's skin. Cold. Impossible cold. And as they touched, everything changed. The alley shifted. The mist thickened. And Jack vanished. Gone. The figure stood there, still and silent. The alley was empty again. Just the distant hum of the city beyond. And in the faint light, the shadows watched. Waiting. Knowing. That crime pays. But the price. It's never the one you expect. The alley was still. The faint hum of the city beyond barely reached the dark corner where Jack had stood moments ago. The figure in the mist lingered. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It was patient. The streetlight flickered once more, then died entirely. A deep, unnatural silence filled the space. The shadows stretched long, as if reaching out from the depths of the earth. Suddenly, a soft rustle came from the far end of the alley. Barely perceptible. It was too quiet. Too slow. Something was shifting. A shadow. A movement. A figure stepped into the dimness. It was Jack. Or at least, it looked like Jack. His face was still hollow. The same vacant eyes. But this time, his movements were different. Faster. Jerky. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The shadows around him seemed to pulse, shifting with each breath he took. The figure in the mist didn't react. It just stood there, watching. Jack took another step forward. Closer now. His footsteps rang out sharply in the quiet alley. They echoed. Louder than they should have. Closer than before. Suddenly, Jack stopped. His head snapped to the side, as if hearing something in the distance. He turned slowly toward the figure in the mist. The emptiness in his eyes deepened. A chill ran through the alley, heavier now. Jack's hand trembled. He reached for the envelope. It was back. But this time, it wasn't clean. It wasn't neat. It was torn, stained with something dark, something old. Jack gripped it tighter. The figure in the mist didn't speak. But the silence between them thickened. Then, the faintest whisper. Barely audible. "Crime pays, Jack." But this time, the voice was different. It wasn't Jack's voice. It was 1,000 voices. 1,000 lost souls. And the shadows seemed to breathe with them. Jack's eyes widened. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He reached out to the figure. But the moment his hand touched the air around it, the figure vanished. Like smoke. Gone. The alley felt colder now. Empty. But not silent. No, the whispers had returned. Low, guttural. They surrounded Jack. As if they were coming from all directions. From within the walls. From beneath the ground. And then, a flicker of movement at the very edge of the alley. A pair of glowing eyes. Watching. Waiting. Crime always pays. But sometimes, it pays in ways no one ever expects. And the cost? The cost never ends, the glowing eyes watched. Unblinking. Piercing through the darkness like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack's heart raced. His breaths were shallow, ragged. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him. The shadows shifted around him, crawling along the ground like living things. The whispers grew louder. Closer. Faint echoes of voices that sounded both familiar and distant. Jack couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the cold concrete. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry, paralyzed. Something was pulling him. A force he couldn't see, but he could feel it. Cold fingers closing in on him. It was like the alley itself had come alive, wrapping its dark, twisted arms around him. He forced his eyes forward. The glowing eyes were still there. Only now they were closer. Much closer. Jack's chest tightened. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had made the deal. He had taken the money. He had thought it was enough. But now, standing here, surrounded by the whispers, the shadows, and the cold, he realized his mistake. Crime pays. But there is always a debt. A price to be paid. And it never stops coming. The figure stepped forward again, its form shifting between the light and the shadows. It wasn't human. It never had been. A hollow, inhuman shape blurred in the edges of perception. A whispering face, or what might have once been a face, now just a twisted mask of shifting shadows. Jack staggered back. The whispering voices grew louder, filling his mind. "Crime pays," they chanted. "Crime pays." A cold, relentless truth. Jack could feel himself sinking into the darkness. His vision blurred, his body trembling. And then, a hand, cold, icy, and unnatural, reached out, grabbing him by the wrist. Its grip was unyielding, pulling him toward the blackness. He tried to pull away, but it was no use. The alley had claimed him. The whispers swirled around him like a storm, drowning him, suffocating him. And then, as the last bit of light flickered and died, the final truth became clear. Crime always pays. But it pays with your soul. And there's no way out. The grip on Jack's wrist tightened. Cold. So cold it burned. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The alley seemed to stretch out forever now, pulling him deeper into the shadows. The walls around him began to warp, twisting in unnatural shapes. The whispers surrounded him, filling his head with thousands of voices, all speaking at once. Crime pays, they hissed. Crime pays. The words were endless, relentless. They echoed off the walls, inside his skull, until he couldn't tell where they came from anymore. He was drowning in them. His vision blurred further. The hand that gripped his wrist pulled harder, dragging him into the blackness, toward the deepest part of the alley where the light could never reach. Jack could feel his body growing weaker, his limbs growing numb. He wanted to fight, but he couldn't move. The darkness around him was closing in, suffocating him. The figure in the mist appeared again. But this time, it was no longer just a shadow. It was more than that. A shape that seemed to shift in and out of existence, its features twisting in and out of focus. A face with no eyes, just hollow, empty sockets where something long dead should have been. The figure's lips moved, and the words came, low and twisted. Did you think you could escape? Jack tried to look away, but the figure's gaze locked onto him, forcing him to stay. A cold wave of fear washed over him, freezing him in place. The whispers grew louder, suffocating his thoughts. Crime pays. Crime pays. Crime pays. The figure moved closer, its form growing larger, more overwhelming. Jack's heart pounded faster, but it didn't matter. There was nowhere to run. The figure reached out with a long, skeletal hand. The fingers were sharp, like broken bone. They brushed against Jack's cheek, sending a shock of ice through his body. A hollow, empty laugh echoed from the depths of the figure's chest. And then, it spoke again, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. You are the price. Jack's vision was slipping. He could feel his grip on reality fading. The world around him was warping, bending. And then, everything went still. The whispers faded. The figure disappeared. The shadows withdrew. The darkness claimed him. And in the final moments of his existence, the only thing Jack heard was the echo of his own name, distorted by the void. A reminder. A warning. Crime pays. But it never lets go. Not until the end. Silence settled over the alley. A heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The mist hung thick in the air, as if time itself had frozen. The shadows no longer moved. The whispers were gone. Only the dim glow of distant streetlights could be seen from the mouth of the alley, flickering like a dying star. But there was no trace of Jack. No sound of his breathing. No sign of his presence. For a long moment, nothing stirred. And then, a soft scraping sound. Barely perceptible at first. A shoe dragging against wet pavement. And slowly, from the depths of the darkness, something emerged. It wasn't Jack. It couldn't be. This thing was different. It moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, as if it was taking its time to observe every corner, every inch of the alley. Its figure was cloaked in darkness, its form shifting in and out of focus. A shadow with no body. It paused. A faint sound echoed from deep within its chest, a low hum. Almost like a sigh. Then it moved forward again, more sure of itself this time. It stopped near the spot where Jack had vanished, crouching down as if examining the ground. And then, the faintest light, barely visible, flickered from its hand. A single, flickering flame. It illuminated a small, tattered envelope. The same one Jack had held. The same one that had disappeared. The figure examined the envelope for a long moment, then, without a word, opened it. Inside, there were no bills, no money. Just a scrap of paper, yellowed with age. The figure's hand shook slightly as it unfolded the note. It was a message. Crime pays, but only once. The figure stood still for a moment, staring at the paper as if it could speak. And then, it crumpled the note in its hand. The faint light from the flame flickered, dimmed, and died. The figure vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing behind. The alley was silent once more. And in the distance, the sound of a siren wailed faintly, cutting through the night. But it was too late. Crime had already been paid for. And in its wake, all that remained was the darkness. Endless. Empty. Waiting. For the next one to come. The siren's wail grew fainter, swallowed by the night. The alley was empty once again, save for the lingering mist. There was no trace of the figure. No sign of Jack. Just the cold silence that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The shadows stretched long and dark, creeping toward the mouth of the alley, where the faint light from the street barely touched. And then, in the far corner, a sound. Soft. Almost imperceptible. A faint shuffle. A figure stepped into view. It was a man. Dressed in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He paused at the edge of the alley, looking around. His eyes scanned the empty street, the silent shadows, and the damp ground. He took a step forward, his footsteps echoing softly against the wet pavement. He wasn't looking for anything, at least not yet. But there was something about the way he moved. As if he were searching for something that wasn't there. He stopped just short of the spot where Jack had disappeared. The place was still, quiet. The air felt thick with a sense of something, waiting. He knelt down, running his gloved fingers over the ground. His touch was slow, deliberate, like he was feeling for something hidden. He looked at the small, crumpled piece of paper that lay on the ground, half buried under the damp dirt. The same note. The same message. Crime pays, but only once. He stared at the words for a long time. His breath seemed to catch in his throat. And then, slowly, he stood up, the paper still clenched tightly in his hand. His expression was unreadable. There was no surprise, no fear. Just a quiet understanding. He tucked the paper into his coat pocket and turned to leave. But as he did, a slight flicker of movement caught the corner of his eye. A shadow. At first, he ignored it. But then it grew. A figure stepped into the alley. Tall. Hooded. Its face hidden in the darkness. The man in the coat stiffened, but didn't move. The figure approached him, slow and deliberate, its footsteps echoing in the silence. They stood facing each other, either speaking. The alley seemed to hold its breath. The man in the coat tilted his head, as if considering something. And then, without a word, he handed over the crumpled note. The figure took it. And for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition between them. A connection. Then, just as quickly, the figure turned away. And with that, the alley was silent again. The man in the coat watched as the figure disappeared into the darkness, melting back into the shadows. And when the last trace of the figure vanished, he turned and walked away, his footsteps swallowed by the night. Crime pays. But it never ends. And the cost? It's always more than you think. For every deal, there's always someone waiting for the next one to take its place. The cycle never stops. And the darkness? It's always there, just beyond the light. Waiting. Watching. For the next soul to claim. The alley was quiet again. A faint, cold breeze swept through, stirring the mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. The distant city lights flickered in the far-off streets, but here, in this forgotten corner, the world seemed suspended in time. Everything felt off-kilter, as if the very air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man. His steps were slow, measured, as if he were treading carefully, afraid of disturbing the silence that had settled over the alley. He wore a dark coat, the collar turned up against the cold, his face obscured by the brim of a hat that cast shadows over his eyes. He moved with purpose, but there was something unsettling about the way he walked, too deliberate, too controlled. He stopped at the mouth of the alley, scanning the darkened stretch of pavement in front of him. His eyes darted from one shadow to the next, searching for something. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. A single, heavy footfall echoed, cutting through the stillness. He was almost at the spot where Jack had vanished. He paused, bending down, running his fingers over the wet ground, feeling for something unseen, something buried. The fog seemed to curl around him, as if the alley itself were alive, watching him. The man stood up and glanced around one last time. And that's when he saw it. A crumpled piece of paper, half buried in the dirt. He knelt down, picked it up carefully. It was a note. Crime pays, but only once. His fingers tightened around the paper, his face unreadable. There was no reaction. No sign of surprise. Just a quiet understanding. He tucked the note into his coat pocket and stood, glancing one last time down the alley. A slight movement at the far end caught his eye. A figure. Tall. Hooded. Their face hidden in the shadows. The man didn't flinch. He simply turned and walked deeper into the alley, his footsteps fading into the darkness. The figure watched him go, its presence almost imperceptible. It was waiting. For the next one. Crime always pays. But it doesn't let go. Not until the end. The alley was quiet, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The fog clung to the ground, swirling in the faint light from the distant street lamps. The mist seemed to move like living things, curling around forgotten corners, hiding secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. The man in the dark coat had disappeared, swallowed by the shadows. His footsteps had faded, leaving only the soft echo of a moment that had passed. The figure in the mist remained, a silent sentinel in the corner of the alley. The whispers had long since faded, their voices swallowed by the void. Yet the sense of waiting, of something unresolved, hung in the air like a dense fog, refusing to dissipate. Then, from the silence, a new sound emerged. A faint crackling, like firewood snapping in a distant hearth. The ground trembled slightly, as though the earth itself was coming alive. And at the far end of the alley, where the shadows gathered thickest, a figure stepped into view. It was not the man in the coat. It wasn't anyone familiar. It was something else entirely. A figure cloaked in black, its face obscured, its form stretching unnaturally tall as it approached the middle of the alley. Its presence was overwhelming. The air seemed to grow heavier with every step it took, as though it was pulling the very atmosphere around it. And as it drew nearer, the alley seemed to close in around it, the walls seeming to bend, as if bowing before this new arrival. The figure stopped in the center of the alley, its eyes glowing faintly beneath the hood. No sound escaped from it. It didn't need to speak. It knew what had happened. It knew what would happen next. And just like that, the figure turned, vanishing into the shadows, swallowed by the very darkness it had come from. The alley was still again. But something had changed. The cycle would continue. The whispers would return. The shadows would wait. Crime always pays. But the price is never what you expect. The end for now.